this talk is actually built of all sorts of other talks, and but they have separate authors, so you'll sort of see them all mixed together. Our part of the Smart H2O project was dynamic pricing, but we quickly realized that we needed help from some more traditional economics or econometrics, and so the people from Polyme really came in and worked up this work on consumer behavior. And then Manuel has come in to link more with hydroeconomic on, and finally we're starting to link this with some of the work that we've done with Pat and others in the past on how to take this information to make decisions on investing. So I'll try to cover all of these, and so it's gonna, you know, the talk is not just about one thing. So if there's an outline, I'd say there'd be 3 sections. How should smart meters change the price of water? Should they be used to? So, you know, we committed to doing work on dynamic pricing, but the most shocking thing has been talking to utilities, how much they absolutely do not plan on doing dynamic pricing. You know, very little interest and very high worry levels, mostly from the social and political reaction. Just the idea, water is charging for water is controversial in many places, even though people sort of expect it because they, I guess, over time have intuitively realized that they're paying for the piping and the personnel. But still, you know, it's just always a political issue. Certainly in the UK, which is where a lot of our work is going to be, it's a privatized water system, which is unique, I think, to the UK and to Chile. And so people are very quick to feel uncomfortable with any kind of pricing change because they think that it's a way for private companies to make more money from it. And in London, which is going to be our main case study, it's owned by an Australian and Chinese financial interests. So people have a very low tolerance, even though the employees are British, people have a very low tolerance for giving money to utilities. So, but that's just the UK context. I think in all contexts, even when it's publicly managed, it's always difficult. The second part is going to be more technical, and this is where we're going to rely mostly on slides from our colleagues, Paula and Ricardo from Polyme, who are not here today, so hopefully I'll be able to just summarize some of the findings. And you know, also to interact with the effort that Andrea Castelletti is going to describe, which is an agent-based model of smart meters. We'd like to know, well, how would, you know, agents, how do consumers react to price changes? And so we really don't know. And so there's going to be you know, basically they latched on to all the methods that we could find that have been used in the past. So a literature review, online questionnaires, and then even recently we thought of doing an online experiment, which we just started thinking of in the last couple of weeks. So I'll just show you some summaries of that. And then finally, well, London is putting in, you know, within 10 years, it's going to have over 2 million smart meters. When we're investing for infrastructure that's going to last for 100 years, should we consider the impact of those smart meters? We don't know how they're going to be used yet, but they're likely going to be used. And so if we're putting in, you know, multi-billion-pound or multi-billion-dollar infrastructure, you know, should it be impacted? Should those decisions, you know, I mean, would they be defensible if they didn't consider these future technologies? So we're definitely into very uncomfortable utility manager territory. They don't agree that they're going to implement smart metering, but they don't disagree that it should be considered when we're talking about investments that are going to be active for 100 years and which cost, you know, a fortune in the billions of pounds. You know, especially, you know, in London, when you do anything, it costs a fortune because you have to move very wealthy people who can hire very good lawyers. In fact, the discussion on investing in London's new reservoir, which they've picked as a place to do that, Oxfordshire, which is probably the place in the world where you have the highest concentration of wealthy and educated people. So convincing them to do away with their estate isn't a trivial task. So, fascinating questions, and hopefully we'll get into them here. Okay, so let's start with so there's a paper that we've all been doing, all the people in the Smart H2O project, and Charles has been leading on it, and it's just thinking about what's the conceptual framework for dynamic pricing, and we've called it economic engineering, based on the paper by Jay, Greg, and Ziming. And it's really saying, okay, you know, as engineers who dabble in economics, what should we do with smart metering? Or what can be done? And just kind of like let's conceptually try to present a clean argument for what can be done. And so we're hoping to submit that soon, and this is a summary of it. So what are the economic engineering opportunities for smart meters? How can they be used to reduce and shift demand? And do we want that? So it's an overall conceptual framework, so it's not going to be detailed modeling. And we're going to look at the impact and benefits of these dynamic pricing. And then we have a proof of concept application to London. Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Just one quick clarification. Is this smart meters for electricity, gas, or for water?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is for water only.
Okay.
Yeah, for water only. You know, basically we're inspired by the adoption in energy. I think in water very, very few have been adopted. And in the UK, it's just being considered by the London utility, which is the most avant-garde of them. So, yeah, this is only water utilities. In the UK, and I think in most developed countries, the water and energy are almost always separate utilities, although there'd be large gains in combining them. I was just looking at Dubai, and in Dubai, the utility is a combined utility. So I think there's scope for combined metering, which is probably by far the cheapest and smartest solution, but I think there's only very few people that are comfortable with that concentration of power. Because you can imagine if there's a smart power and energy meter in your home, basically there's nothing that utility doesn't know about what's going on in your home. But and that points to some of the acceptability and communication issues with all of this, which you're going to see is just a can of worms. And so yeah, this is definitely water. So let's look at these conceptually and see, you know, grossly what it would look like for London, and then maybe a bit of discussion. So the London case study, you know, fundamentally, it's about half and half surface water, groundwater, and you have this is the whole Thames Basin, and you have a whole series of sources. These are mostly groundwater sources. There's some conjunctive use sources. There's an aggregate London reservoir, which is all they have for now, which only has about 70 days of storage. So it's very different from California. There's no over-year storage. They really depend on groundwater and river flow. But the big controversial asset is this Oxford Reservoir, which has been debated for 20 years. And going to meetings where that's discussed is very entertaining because it stays very British, but it's very aggressive. Which means you have to be there for at least 10 years to pick up on the tension in the room. But that tension is responsible for a lot of interest in the work. So that's very good. But so fundamentally, so if this, you know, when we simulate it, which we'll see in the third part, this is the system we'll look at. But for this conceptual, you know, fundamentally we're looking at some kind of storage which is taken from a river with environmental interests and other interests, and it's going to provide water or some of the water supply to the source. So it's a quite generic. So even though the real system is locally specific, this analysis is going to stay quite generic. The other thing that's quite generic is that, surprise, surprise, over time there's a supply-demand imbalance. So these are the best estimates from the utility. They feel that their their supply, each bar here is an estimate of what they call their yield. And so because of potentially climate change and because of especially institutional changes, basically the environment agency tending to want to claw back, as they call it, licenses. So in the US, in the UK, there's a lot more government involvement, and there's no water rights, there's water licenses. So you use water at the will of the government. And as people have become more wealthy, they value more the environment, and so the tendency is for the utilities to have their water rights become less secure over time. So obviously it's discontinuous, but this is sort of this is how the utility perceives that their supply is going to decrease, and then this is how they perceive that their demand is going to increase. And so, obviously these numbers are wrong, and they're really they're trying to move from a worst case type capacity expansion to a more risk-based or uncertainty inspired framework. And so part of that is the work that we'll show in the third part of the talk. But this is part of the context. Basically, they're very worried about the supply and demand imbalance starting soon, and that's pushing the reservoir. And the backstory here is that the water company has rate of return regulations, so they get 5% profit on everything they own. So they want the reservoir. They want it bad. They don't get anything from demand management. But the OFWAC, the economic regulator, is very uncomfortable with anything that doesn't have a mix of supply and demand, because then interventions, because then it looks unbalanced. And it's generally known that they don't really make money anymore. Initially, when Thatcher privatized in 1990, there was all these gains from cost efficiencies that were made, but those were quickly exhausted in a half decade. And so now, fiddling with costs and reducing demand actually doesn't bring the companies that much profit. It's more of a new supply. So there's an institutional context which is quite complicated. And there's been challenges in smart H2O. So my colleagues have been surprised at how Thames Water hasn't been that cooperative and hasn't been that interested in some of our work. And that's also linked to that institutional background where they don't really have a financial incentive to do metering unless it's required by the economic regulator. So having us say, oh, it's going to work great and be amazing, isn't. They sort of, they're all from the London area, so they all want to do the work, but they realize that it's, if they come up with, we don't need a reservoir if we do this amazing smart metering, that's unlikely to put them on a promotion track into top management. So it's a very subtle and complicated environment, but it's definitely very interesting. Okay, so fundamentally, smart metering, the big thing is that you get frequent, rather than, my utility calls me about once a year they make me go read my meter, or else they just make up the numbers. So going from once a year to once every 15 minutes or so is a big deal. So that's what we're talking about. There's going to be frequent measurements. And then, the smart H2O project, this is only a very smart part of it, small part of it. A lot of it is based on social interaction of users looking at their smartphones and looking at interacting with the data. And that's probably the most exciting part of it. And frankly, I think that the dynamic pricing is actually quite uninteresting in itself. I think what's going to make it perhaps successful is the fact that the consumer will be advised of pricing changes as they happen. I think that if they happened in the background, it would just make people angry, and not much would happen. People would just say, oh, well, now they're making more money off me. But I think if you get alerts and if you can link it to your social media, there's going to be a sort of culture change. And I think, a lot of that could peter off very quickly if you just had, for example, alerts. But if it's alerts telling you, the environment has been fine for the past 12 months with your water abstraction, but during the next 3 weeks, it's not going to be, and we're going to charge you to reflect that, and that money is going to be taken for environmental investments in our area in the next, that is going to catch people's attention. So there's definitely there's some exciting possibilities. And the other thing that we decided was, you could imagine right away a very complicated rating structure, but we're going to purposely keep it very simple, mostly because it's a conceptual paper, but also because the political and customer acceptability of anything complicated, because at least in the UK, their assumption is this is a ploy to rip us off. You better be able to communicate it very simply, or else it's going to be uncomfortable. So this is what we've looked at, scarcity pricing and peak pricing. So scarcity pricing is basically drop time demand reduction, and it aims at improving the overall economic efficiency of the water allocation between sectors. And so we're anticipating this is something that would be done in the UK, certainly from a weekly to seasonal timescale. I think in certain systems with more over-year storage like California, you might have an expensive water year. In the UK, droughts are a few weeks long, and so you just have expensive weeks, and so maybe you have a price change every week. So that would obviously be different depending on the context. The other way we think that smart metering could happen is peak pricing. And so there, instead of demand reduction, you're trying to do demand shifting. So you're trying to shift it in time. And there's cost efficient. So those are economic improvements, and these are financial improvements on the right. We'll look at those when we talk about that section. And here we're talking about daily changes. Hourly, just like energy. Okay, so scarcity pricing. Right, so what we're going to do here is increase the price of water, the volumetric price of water, is somehow commensurate with water stress. So there's all sorts of ways you could do that, but fundamentally, if you have some kind of hydrological index or some index linked to reservoir levels, as maybe in Spain, where reservoirs are used more, and you're going to translate that into a change in price. And the goal here is to achieve a better balance between allocation between sectors. In California, the fundamental allocation problem, I think, is between ag, environment, and urban. In the UK, there's very little agriculture, so it's really urban water supply versus the environment. That's the main trade-off, and that's the tension in the UK. And so, as it is now in the UK, when the reservoir is considered a threatening level, the environment safeguards get progressively reduced. There's an environmental flow, but as London's single reservoir goes down, we just chuck the environment out the window. And so what's happening is that you have some very expensive real estate in London, and you have a lot of tourism. And so, maybe just to allow consumers to be inefficient and not care about what's actually going on in the environment, we actually may be suffering large costs. If you go to the river and you expect to take a nice picture of Big Ben, but there's a mud flat which is smelly, what would that economically, what does that do? What does that do to all sorts of sectors in the UK economy? And is the cost of people not caring about their consumption worth the cost of decreased environmental quality? Certainly in places like London, that's relevant, right? Because people pay crazy amounts for a view. So if you aggregate all that, the financial or the economic numbers are quite staggering. So so what we could do here is send a tangible signal to consumers, which is saying, well, the environment didn't care about your water consumption in the last 5 years, but now during a month, you're killing fish or you're whatever. And I think there's a nice message that could be done there. And if that message is calibrated right, the proportion of people who are very angry is going to be reduced. I think that's the best way that we can sell. So the challenges are acceptability and maintaining impact. So how can you maintain it over time? So this is a nice figure that Charles came up with. So how do what is it going to look like? Well, fundamentally, so this is a demand curve. So this is something that Jay has championed, that we engineers have said demand is a number, right? People want this much water. And economists say people don't want this much of anything. They're willing to pay more and more as that thing becomes scarce, more and more scarce. So as water becomes less available to you, the price you're willing per unit to pay for it becomes a lot higher. So if you're only able to satisfy a little bit of your demand, this black line tells you that you'd be willing to pay a high price. And so right now, we're assuming that, well, this is P0 is the original price, and that this is the price at which people get charged. If we wanted to reduce their consumption by this amount, then if we know this curve and we actually know how people's consumption is dependent on price, well, then if we wanted to reduce by this much, we would just increase the price by this much. Now, Greg has been the pioneer in saying, well, financially, what's the consequences of this? And fundamentally, well, this is the revenue that you would lose, right? Because people are using this much less, and this is how much you charge. So you're losing this amount. You're gaining this amount, which is the same amount. And the problematic part is this, right? This would be extra funds that the utility would perceive from this operation. And this intuitively is what people don't like. So there's two things you can do with that black box. You can either, well, the problem is it's an environmental tax if you leave it in there, right? And so you either can do an increasing block tariff, well, this is just removed, right? So, it'll only be people who consume these larger amounts that would pay that. Or what you can do is just take this to invest in the environment or in other social benefits or in making social tariffs, which is tariffs that are more advantageous for lower income people. So fundamentally, that's what we're talking about, what this looks like. Okay, so this is what scarcity pricing actually looks like. And so here are the economics of it. This is a nice classical diagram of water economics. And what this is looking at, this is, again, this demand curve, okay? And this is another demand curve of all other sectors. So this is human consumers, city dwellers, and this is all the aggregate economic demands from other sectors. And we've just taken this plot and just reversed it like this. So these plots are really showing the equivalent thing. And you can see here that if this is the available volume of water. And you can see that if there's plenty of available water, they don't interact. We can go down, this sector can use all of this volume until they have no further interest. They wouldn't pay anything more for more water. So they can use all of their demand, and the same thing for consumers. They can use as much as they want, because if you offer them more, they wouldn't be willing to pay more. That's how you know that they have everything they want. And then this price that they're currently paying reflects this increase, which is actually the cost of providing the service, the pipes and the personnel. So what happens under scarcity is this, is all of a sudden the available volume shrinks, okay? And so all of a sudden there's not enough water to satisfy everyone. And so what's happening now in the UK is that, well, people continue paying this price. And so the environment, would then only receive this much. And so if they were used to getting this before, all this environmental water has now been removed from availability to the environment, which means that basically there's a large cost. I mean, if this yellow curve is actually reflecting the economic benefits to all other sectors, in the UK it's particularly the environment, the society is losing money to be able to subsidize the urban consumers. And so, so what we're going to try to do is remediate that by following what's called the equimarginal principle, which is simply saying that the incremental benefit that all the users get should be the same, right? And that's the way to make sure that one sector is not subsidizing another, one sector is not unfairly receiving water. So in the London application, the numbers that we put on, so these are disclosed numbers. So the official minimum flow before it has any kind of reduction associated with the London reservoirs are 800 million liters per day. And Charles spent a lot of time looking for papers where, can we get the demand curve for other sectors, right? And so in general, I've been trying to push hydroeconomic modeling in the UK. I think the biggest challenge I've had is that there's no academics doing this kind of work, so there's no published studies of demand curves for anything related to water. And so there's a real, we're like, well, that's a brilliant framework, but we don't know, we can see from your analysis that everything is determined by those demand curves, and so if we're not comfortable with them, or we don't know if they're correct, then we don't know, we don't want to manage in this hyper-economic way, because the fundamental driver of it is the demand curves that we're uncomfortable with. But two leading consultants did come up with the area under this curve, so the full annual economic benefits to London, and a reputed firm came up with an estimate of $250 million per year. And a water company came up with a similar one. So let's just assume that that's okay. And so that's just going to help us more or less calibrate a environmental demand curve. Now, this was for environmental services. The problem in London, and this has not been studied at all, is that there are all sorts of other benefits like tourism and property values. And so we just decided, well, let's take the current estimate and then double it. And so we have this very primitive sensitivity analysis with the current and high value of water scenario. And then, okay, now we're gonna look at London, and we're gonna simulate it weekly and look at three sets of results. The first is, this is the London control diagram. So what this is saying is, based on how much water is in the London reservoir, over different months, the environmental flow allocation gets reduced. Okay, so this is the control rule of London, saying, as a function of the reservoir, how those environmental flows get reduced. So that's what we're going to simulate in black. In blue, we're going to look at the valuation, which said that the environment was worth $250 million a year. And in the red, we're going to look at 500. So these are the weekly results of about an 80-year simulation. And so this is shortage to the environment. And so the black one is with the current rule. So you can see this is a 600-day snapshot of the 1920s drought, which was the biggest water scarcity event in the UK. And what we can see is that this is how much the environment would get shortchanged under current management and demands if we had the rule-based system. Okay, and then if we enact the scarcity pricing, right, where costs are going up as a function of, in this case, reservoir levels, in this case, it flows, you can see that mostly the environment gets shortchanged less. Although in this very extreme part of the drought, and this we still have to explain in full detail, actually there's a reversal, and basically I think this smart metering shows this scarcity pricing is actually more flexible, saying really in a period of really extreme shortfall, the environment is actually going to get less because there's starting to be a human danger. So in general, it's beneficial to the environment, but we're also seeing that this change in management under extreme shortfalls may actually build resilience. So generally, we were quite happy with this. And then what this implied in terms of price increase. So, okay, we followed smart dynamic pricing. How much would prices change? And you can see, well, in the worst case, you're talking about the doubling. During that extreme scenario, we're talking about the doubling of the cost of consumers. So doubling the price, once in 100 years is probably not that radical, and it allows you, a more economically efficient way to manage your system. So this seems promising. So Charles just summarized some numbers. There was 202 milliliters per day on average of environmental flow shortage during this event, and these approaches had none. And then this was looking at the amount of days on average over the full time horizon that you could get of days with price increases. So just some summary numbers. Okay, right. So that was it for scarcity pricing. So let's go to peak pricing. So scarcity pricing is a way to reduce demands and share water more equitably or efficiently between sectors. Peak pricing is how can we shift demand for various reasons and at certain times in the day. So this is really an imitation of energy smart metering, daily variable energy. So you can imagine if you're into capacity expansion, which a few of us are interested in since many years, but it's become the whole research. It's quite clear that if you could reduce, it's peak consumption, so it's those hours of the day where everyone's using a shower that are actually leading to a lot of the maintenance problems and a lot of the capacity expansion requirements of systems. So if you could just shave off a bit of consumption during those peak times, you could probably delay investment, you could delay maintenance, and you could probably, in some systems, reduce the energy consumption. Now, one of the reasons why the London people paid less attention to us is that they have set up their system, because they've had changing energy prices for many years now, they've set up their system where they pump at night when it's cheap, and they have 1 day of storage around the city, and so they didn't care about this. But I bet you there's a lot of cities which are all of a sudden going to bring on energy, the energy cost is all of a sudden going to start varying, and then the water company is going to say, crap, we didn't know you were going to do that. Now we have to build 50 water towers. This would be a way to manage that transition. So again, it sends a tangible signal to consumers. If you use at this time of the day, this is what's causing us to increase your rate in the future, right? Because that's what happens. It's the fact that everyone takes a shower at the same time that is causing the fact that there's going to be a 2% increase in your water price. There's a very tricky utility communication challenge there. And so these challenges are the same for peak pricing, I think. Okay, here's another, so this is the same figure as the other one, but now looking at peak pricing. And so this is the normal pricing. So for this demand, this is how much we ask consumers. But now we split it up into two, where there's a cheaper off-peak rate, and then there's a higher peak rate. And they each have, their associated demand curve. And you can see that, well, if you combine this one with this one, you would end up with the same revenue. You would just have much higher prices during those peak times, for example, in the morning and in the evening. And the hope is that you would then reduce, if this is demand or this is consumption, you would reduce, you're especially interested in reducing during peak times. So this is what the pricing, the justification for the pricing. So when we apply this to London, we looked at we didn't do a detailed analysis, but we just assumed the growth of 0.6%. And then, you can't see this here, but this is a quadratic relationship that Charles found from Australia, which showed evidence of a quadratic relationship between peak usage reduction and cost of investing in new mains. And we have a lot of experts in urban pipe supplies, and hopefully they will say that this is actually true. That if you can reduce peak usage, you're going to get a lower cost of investment in new mains, because those mains are going to have to be smaller diameters, and you're going to have less maintenance problem with them. So we used, because in London they didn't really know about this relationship, we extrapolated this relationship to network expansion and replacement, giving an average taken per property cost of 2,000, installation and replacement of 2,000 pounds. So basically we expanded this based on a few data points that we had in the UK that seemed reasonable. And the financial savings associated with different levels of peak hour price increases can then be estimated, and we had an assumption of the government discount rate and a price elasticity of demand of 0.4, negative 0.4, which I'll talk about in the next section. So this is what it looked like for London. Basically, if you could increase, if you could, double or even triple peak hour price, these are the estimated £1 million discounted savings of both for mains replacement. So if you double your cost, you would save 200 million net present value, and if you combine both expansion and replacement, you could get almost at $500 million. So it looks like a priori that there's some major benefits of this peak pricing. Obviously, we would, these are based with literature values, and we'd have to convince the network managers in London that this is true for their systems. But potentially there seems like there are some large gains. Right, so the last slide on the dynamic pricing. So we proposed two potential approaches, scarcity pricing and peak pricing. Scarcity pricing was reducing demand. It seems like it has a potential for reducing the vulnerability of drought, and especially making a more appropriate balance between sectors under scarcity, which is more economically efficient. You can set it up to be, depending on what you do with that surplus revenue, you can shield the utility or shield the politicians from being told that it's an environmental tax. The biggest problem is setting those numbers is going to be difficult because that means if you want to do it in an economically efficient way, you have to know what the demands are for the different subsectors. So certainly good work for some economists there. In peak pricing, we're trying to shift demand. It's financial savings, not economic savings, and it's mostly delayed capacity expansion and maintenance. And really, that study would have to be redone for every network, for every city. But definitely, we thought that this was promising. I think this is offset by, the inertia in the system is going to be the customer and political acceptability of doing these things. Okay, back to the outline. We've done part one, and I spent most of my time on that. Yes, go ahead, David.
On the section 2, why are the managers so resistant or hesitant about the reducing their peak demand? I mean, to me that just seems like essentially one of the easiest ways to effectively better manage demand. Most of the utility managers I've worked with are just eager to hear suggestions for how they can do this.
Yeah, I think certainly in the UK they're also eager because they know that the economic regulator is all for it and that it's going to be seen as something very positive. I think they're very uncomfortable because they feel they have no predictability over how people are actually going to respond and how that response is if it's going to last over time. And that brings us to the second section, which is our colleagues at Podium desperately trying to come up with credible estimates. So how are consumers actually going to react to this, and how is that, what if it just becomes a new normal? After a few weeks, people just stop caring and consume like they did in the past.
So the concern is there going to be an effect? Is it persistent?
That's right. So basically, what worries the UK people is they're not comfortable with relying on demand management methods. They do it because they're forced to, but the engineers that we deal with say, I can't rely on that. I don't know if it's going to happen.
It's just a great example for Southern California. Southern California has had tremendous population growth in the last 20 years, but it uses the same amount of water total as it did 20 years ago.
Yeah. So in London as well, there's been a reduction.
And Boston actually uses less water now than it did 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I'm sure if you look at engineered provisions 20 years ago, that people didn't predict that.
Right.
And so, there's well-deserved paranoia about being wrong in predictions, and I think they've seen that trend, but they're not comfortable. Certainly in the UK, they're not comfortable assuming that trend is going to continue, and then they also sort of have a financial incentive not to believe that trend is going to continue. So I'm going to go over these. There's a lot of slides. I'm going to go just summarize it because it's not work that I did, and I'm not. We were only partially involved. But fundamentally, the meta-analysis is just looking at 200 studies and looking at every economist who's made an estimate of price elasticity of demand, which is a favorite topic of economists. And then online questionnaires, so asking people. So it's revealed preference. What do you think you're going to do? And so, can we trust that? Or, certainly, it's giving you interesting data points, but how should we use that information is difficult. And then some crazy person in our proposal said that we were going to do experimental economics. We were going to experiment with real humans in a room and somehow devise some experiment to see how dynamic pricing would change their consumption. But then when we actually had to do it, we said, okay, what's the experiment? And no one could figure out an experiment to do. And so we talked to some really calling me experimental economists, and you know, they really scratched their heads, and we haven't really figured out really how to make an experiment. And certainly, but we have a try here that I'll show you. Certainly in the UK, you know, being given access to real consumers who can write to the press, you know, the utilities are very careful how they handle their collaborating academics. They don't let you talk to their customers. And so doing experiments with customers, you know, has been touchy. So we heard about something called Amazon Mechanical Turk, or I don't know if that's actually its name, but apparently you can hire people to do games and experiments online. And we might try to do that if we can figure out whether or not we need human experiment authorization from the university. So these are, so that probably not going to go into much more detail. And then the final point is going to be, well, what should we do about this issue? So very quickly, so Ricardo and Paolo from Bonami did this work. And, you know, basically the point is, you know, look at the literature, estimate the price elasticities, and then use this in the agent-based models that Andrea and his colleagues are going to build, both Andreas. So that's the general framework. The studies, there's economists love doing this, so it's been done since the 60s. And it's done at a decreasing rate, asking yourself the question, how do consumers react to price? So, and that's called the price elasticity of demand. So there's lots of studies. This is the distribution of price elasticity estimates. So you can see that's about -0.2 or 3. So that's for a doubling of the water price, a 20 to 30% reduction in water use. So that's what more or less we think.
Julian, is that residential? Is that
Yeah,
overall?
residential, sorry.
And
Yeah.
is that residential indoor, outdoor, combined?
I think it's residential indoor, but they would confirm. Yeah. So you know, so yeah, it's probably about that much. I'm sort of surprised that people keep doing these studies. You know, just kind of put -0.3 and do something else. But
I want to see the study that got almost 4.
yeah, I mean, you
I'm
know,
curious about anything with a positive elasticity.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's some exotic examples. You know, once you have 200 studies, there's going to be a weird contact
That's the
somewhere.
order of many studies. And it's, I mean, I've had that exact same thought.
Yeah,
Same study, same result,
yeah.
Different economists.
different economists, different city,
Yeah.
different state.
Yeah, so-
Indoor, outdoor, it doesn't matter.
Needless to say, you know, as an engineer who loves economics, the interest of utility managers of these numbers is about similar to the interest of groundwater managers to the groundwater economics literature. So there's all sorts of real groundwater managers, and sort of when you tell them that there's a 50-year literature on the optimal level of pumping groundwater, they sort of look at you and say, why haven't those people ever spoken to me? You know, they never heard about that work. So definitely, you know, there's some. I think as engineering economists, we can bring something that we're bringing the economics into the engineering. So basically they build a big regression model with all these studies. They try to estimate how the price elasticity would vary with different things. You know, including the structure of the industry and the time of the year and all sorts of things. And so that, you know, they do econometrics, and so it's a nice study, and I think it'll be published. They're looking at location, you know, socioeconomic factors in the area, the tariff structure, the water scarcity level, and the regulatory framework. So you know, these are their explanatory variables. You know, of course, they're using water stress indicators, and whenever you look at a water stress indicator of the world, and you look at your region, and your region is always, you intuitively feel that, how is that indicator correct for my region? Hence the plethora of indicator, stress indicator, because there's just so many ways to do it. It's very hard to do it in a good way. But so they used some of these values, and they all come up very similar. So, anyways, but there they are. So we used -0.3. Okay.
Julie, I have a quick question. Maybe you don't know the answer to it.
Yeah.
There have been at least 3 or 4 meta-analysis studies similar to exactly what you just showed that were done in 98, 2003, 2006.
Yeah, I think this study includes those and all the subsequent.
Is there any difference or new findings in its most recent one and the prior ones, or is that also?
I think it's just a little movement of that distribution. But yeah, I don't remember them telling us that it was a very strong one. So basically, we don't know and assume -0.3. That seems like a reasonable start. Okay, so that was the meta-analysis.